Hi, everybody. This week, we are looking at Chapter 13 in your textbook, Media Economics in the Global Marketplace. There's going to be a lot of concepts and themes and keywords that we've already heard in other parts of the semester, but this is the week where we really get to focus on how those things play out, separate from looking at them through specific kinds of media. So this lecture, as I said, is based on Chapter 13, and it will make much more sense if you've at least skimmed that chapter before watching the lecture or listening to it. This chapter focuses not on specific content or media types like some of the other weeks have, but as we're in this sort of subgrouping of looking at media as industry and business, we're focusing more on we're focusing more on the structure of media as an industry and the economics of mass media. And we'll investigate the breakdown of economic borders and look at the focus on media consolidation, corporate mergers, synergy, deregulation, and the economic global village. And then we'll move on to address ethical and social issues in media economics, investigating the limits of antitrust law, the concept of consumer control, and the threat of cultural imperialism. We'll also briefly examine the rise of new digital media conglomerates and consider the impact of media consolidation on democracy and the diversity of the global marketplace. A lot of these things, again, are things we've touched on already. So this is a review. As we discussed in other chapters, globally, there are different structures of media industry to review. In a monopoly structure, one company dominates the production and distribution within media industries. And in an oligopoly structure like we have in most US industries, very few firms dominate the industry. Another model is called limited competition. In limited competition, there are many producers and settlers, but only a few products available in the market. Limited competition structures are very common in radio and newspaper media industries, as opposed to the oligopoly structure of television, movies, and social media. Over time, the landscape of media industries in the United States has undergone pretty massive structural changes, which we've also talked about briefly in the past. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, the trend was actually towards more regulation of media industries, right? We saw this again and again with radio and television, that as a new industry or a new technology emerged, it would be all kind of free-for-all in the beginning, and then there would be a long period of figuring out how to regulate it, how to organize it. And a lot of that was done through government regulation. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890, outlawed monopolistic practices. The Clayton Antitrust Act was passed in 1914 and deepened that regulation by prohibiting manufacturers from getting or having exclusive dealers or contractors, which made it harder to control large parts of the market. And then in the I'm gonna butcher that. Seller-Kefauver Act in 1950, that built even further on this prior legislation and limited corporate mergers and joint ventures that reduced competition. And we'll see how that's actually been overturned in a second. So many industries, especially media industries, didn't like these regulations and engaged in a lot of lobbying, which we learned a lot about 2 weeks ago, and campaigns, a lot of PR work in particular, to try to weaken regulations after 1950. They found success with the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which we talked about a lot more when we were looking at television and a little bit when we were talking about its failure to really be strong enough to actually address the internet. So the Telecommunications Act, passed in 1996, removed or weakened all prior media industry legislation, right? So it overrode all of these things, which created more regulation. And so over the past 30 years, this has solidified an oligopoly structure of media industries as the dominant model in the US because of this weakened and lack of regulation, right? In the United States in particular. So there are some dominant business tendencies that have emerged in media industries, which are all heavily characterized by this deregulation. These include the trend towards information economy, consolidation, the expansion of flexible markets, and downsizing. So the one that we'll start with is the transformation of media industries towards information technologies, or is making their money through information that these companies can extract and produce about audiences. This week, I've asked you all to watch the documentary on the empire of Amazon and Jeff Bezos as an individual. And a lot of what this is about is this rise of the significance of data, whether that's the buying and selling of data or the construction and management of server housing so that one can own the space that the data is kept. This is what we refer to as the information economy. In a few companies, some dominant tendencies also have to do with a move towards flexible market structures, which has included the growth of service sectors and also intense specialization in different companies and sectors within media industries. The move towards flexible specialization service-based markets requires large amounts of cheap labor, which is why media companies have worked to destroy and block labor unions within their sectors. Again, something that they talk about a lot in that documentary for this week. Finally, downsizing and the way that it produces wage gap inequalities are some other troubling trends in media industries. Companies have downsized to get rid of many full-time positions while expanding these flexible positions. So instead of hiring more employees in full-time positions, what they've been doing now is this kind of is common kind of, it's not only in media industries, but more broadly in economic marketplace practice right now, is that the employer, instead of hiring full-time positions, will more and more hire employees that are hired as part of a contract worker, right? So they're not full-time, they're seen as third-party contractors, which means the business does not need to supply them with benefits. It does not need to recognize them as workers. It doesn't even need to be the entity that handles the taxes or pays into Social Security on behalf of that worker. So this means the companies can pay people way less and not have to provide those benefits, right? And that makes it harder for people to make a living. This contributes directly to a continually growing wage gap in media industries between executives and other employees, so that you have this insane strata of people making many, many, many times what the people below them make in a year, right? So here's a great demonstration of this. So these few people here up at the top, right, the CEOs at the top, each one of them makes as much money as this many people. Right? And our book describes that a little bit better as well. Another trend has been towards consolidation and mergers of companies. And this is further concentrating media and power in media, which, as we said earlier, with the breakdown of all of these antitrust regulations with the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and all of those previous legislations that had barred mergers and conglomerations and consolidations, suddenly the market opened up for this to become a possibility. And it did in droves very quickly. So you can see here some of the major deals that are listed. Disney bought ABC for $19 billion, and Time Warner bought Turner Broadcasting for $7.5 billion. And this just continues. I don't have the most current one here, but if you're interested, you can look this up. There were a significant number of mergers and consolidations that happened during COVID while all of us were busy on TikTok. These companies were busy buying each other and really consolidating their power. So while media has continued to consolidate, their output has grown immensely, especially in the digital age. These companies continue to generate more and more content, which may make it seem to us like we have more choices than we used to, especially if we think back to like broadcast media. And we've talked about this in the past, where there was just maybe 4 channels that were on available at any time. But even though we have a lot of media to consume, critics argue that media consolidation really just creates the illusion of choice, because only 6 media companies control over 90% of what we read, watch, or listen to in the United States. 6 companies. 6 media companies that were referred to here as DNews, Core Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. And some of those names might not be so familiar, but the ones under their umbrella will probably be very familiar to you. So you can see here, right? So GE, News Corp, right? You can see all of the ones that they own. This is, I think, pretty funny in a lot of ways, because you'll see that sometimes places that seem to espouse different ideologies or position themselves culturally in different framing, we've talked about this before too, are actually under the same umbrella. So they've diversified their market of audience share. For example, GE owns NBC, Comcast, which is the most common cable provider in the United States, and Warner Brother owns CNN, HBO, ESPN, or sorry, no, CNN, HBO, Time Warner. So you can see how these kinds of broader companies own a lot of companies that we might think of as being massive and dominant in their own area. You'll also see how many of these companies own media across media industries, meaning they'll own a movie studio and a television studio, as well as a cable company and a newspaper, all under one umbrella. So they're really trying to make sure that they get as much of a market and also are appealing to different audiences often so that they can have as much of a share of our eyeballs as they can get. So they're really consolidating not just within a particular type of media, but across these industry landscapes and holdings. If companies do have some more substantial competition today in the new digital media conglomerates that you're already familiar with, Apple and then Google or Alphabet, which these are the same thing, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook or Meta. However, these companies have strongly resisted being classified as media companies. And they argue that just facilitating the sharing of content and the content that's created by others. So even though media companies are not heavily regulated, technology companies are even less regulated, which is why they insist on referring to themselves as tech companies rather than as media companies in order to avoid a lot of regulation. So these newer digital media conglomerates have put a lot of money into lobbying and advertising to try to prevent any classification as a media company and therefore regulation by the government. So if we look at the top 10 media corporations today, we don't see any of the big six giants, but we do see all of the new digital media conglomerates in the top 10. So we'll also see a couple of Chinese companies, Tencent and Alibaba, and then, have become rivals for US media dominance on the global stage. And many who theorize these things expect that other Chinese companies will continue to overtake those in the US over time. However, currently the United States still maintains the greatest hold over international media. And one reason to be concerned about that, along with all of these trends and tendencies of media industries like conglomeration and oligopoly structures, is because of something called hegemony. So, hegemony describes the acceptance of dominant values and culture by those who are subordinate to those who hold economic and political power. That means that those who don't have power are forced into positions of having to accept the ideas, the culture, the wishes, whatever, of those who do have power, if that makes sense. Another way of saying this is that hegemony is the idea that those within power in society are those who define our common dominant values and ideals in society. So the person who theorized the idea of cultural hegemony is a man named Antonio Gramsci. In his work, he has argued, as the quote here says, that the rule of one class over another does not depend on economic or physical power alone, but on persuading the ruled to accept the system of beliefs of the ruling class and to share their social, cultural, and moral values. So, through methods of persuasion, those in power influence and shape what people think is normal, what we believe, and how we think about those in power and their relationships to one another and to us. Another important figure who we would have also talked about and who we talked about in week 9 when we were also thinking about this, the culture of persuasion that comes out of public relations, which we can see is connected to what we're talking about today, is Edward Bernays, who was often thought of as the father of PR, as we said in the past, the heir apparent of Ivy Lee. In his work, The Engineering of Consent, Bernays argued that what he called this engineering of consent, or the freedom to persuade, was or to suggest, was at the heart of democracy. And it's a very controversial idea, but it has set a foundation for modern public relations industries, ideas on advertising, media persuasion, and will probably for many years to come. His influence is relevant for discussions about hegemony because he suggested that it was okay for those in power to manipulate or persuade the masses. Not only that it was okay, but that it was in fact a kind of moral duty for those in power to do such a thing, right? So that his work is central to how propaganda has been mobilized in the United States and how we think a lot about our relationship not only to people in our own country, but internationally. So one way that hegemony works through media is through the construction of common narratives, not unlike PR, as we talked about when we were talking about framing, or through stories that make certain values and ideas seem universal or like common sense. The reason that common narratives or storytelling tactics work is that they identify with a culture's dominant values, which, as we've discussed, are defined by those in power in theory, but are made to seem universal. right? And all of this stuff continues to exist in the ways that we understand things. So, we discussed in this lecture how media and industries work as an oligopoly, where we have few options and control over media is in the hands of a very small group of very powerful companies, which we named the big six dominant media companies, as well as the five new digital media companies in our current model of media industries in the US. Audiences and consumers have little choice or control over content, access, or structure, and cost of media, among other things. And so, this is the case that you might ask why there's so little public debate or awareness about the problematic structure of media industries. we did just discuss hegemony and the kind of powerful nature of the ways that narratives are deployed in society. And so, in large part, these structures are unchallenged because people don't believe that they need to, because we've bought into this narrative of the American dream in the United States, or at least in part, we're still all influenced by it. Even if we might do it in a way where we think a little bit critically of it, we still tend to fall into it. And it determines how we think about the world. And also, it influences us and shapes the way we think about certain stories and certain political arrangements and economic structures. There are many reasons why the structural problems in media industries are often ignored beyond hegemony. But our textbook highlights three major issues, and I think they are important for us to pay attention to. So, this is the equation of free markets with democracy and the lack of criticism about capitalism. And this is a huge one. The way that we talk about democracy is if it is completely connected to free markets, right? And free markets are democratic. Democracy is free market, right? They are seen to be almost interchangeable. The second is a lack of consensus about consumer power versus corporate power. Again, that's a narrative that you'll see comes up a lot in the documentary I've asked you to watch this week. And finally, our issues of cultural imperialism. So we're going to touch on these individually. So free markets equal democracy or don't, right? So media companies in the US have a long history of trying to position themselves as working on behalf of the public good and as a way to avoid regulation and criticism. What this has meant has been that media companies helped to align political ideals of democracy with economic ideals of capitalism. But this relationship between democracy and capitalism is not a given, but they have made it seem as if it is. In fact, many scholars actually argue that capitalism as an economic structure works to undermine democracy often, especially in free market arrangements or where corporations operate unchecked. Capitalist structures of business will always prioritize profits over other factors, including the public good, which means that sometimes it will act in direct contrast with democratic ideals. Again, something we'll see in the documentary that you're watching this week. For example, this is why we historically have seen little change in the hegemonic narratives of media and television, because these companies will almost always choose to make what they know will be profitable, a story that they know will be successful over something controversial or even just new and interesting that might not appeal to as wide of an audience or might open them up to criticism. We see this especially with the sort of constant remaking of existing narratives, right? We see the same movie, the same books being turned into multiple different versions, one after the other, because one was successful. Media has contributed to making capitalism something that seems difficult to criticize, if not impossible to imagine a life outside of. Because it has become so tied to America as a country and to our ideals of democracy in this country and to our understanding of the American dream. But this lack of criticism of capitalism has mostly just meant that companies have continued to grow more powerful in the United States, while the government has grown weaker and has less influence. And the government, remember, is also all of us together collectively. So that leaves these companies largely unchecked and able to influence society and culture with fewer repercussions. Again, something that gets talked about in the documentary. The second issue is that of consumer choice versus consumer control. And this is another way that media companies have tried to avoid regulation and criticism about their structure. What these companies have provided to us is consumer choice, which is the ability to choose among a wide range of products, right? You open Netflix, there's so many things now that they have to suggest something to you or play something for you automatically based on your algorithm. And what these companies, so they've provided this consumer choice, but while that might seem more democratic, and in some ways we definitely have access to narratives we haven't seen as much of before, there's that still, in reality, it isn't very democratic at all because we still have no power to influence the products that we have to choose from, who controls them and how the profits from them are distributed, who profits from them, right? An alternative to consumer choice that would be considered more democratic would be something like consumer control. Consumer control gives customers or audiences power in deciding what kinds of media gets created and circulated. Consumer control is something that is exerted through government regulation, alternative media, and activist media. But because media companies have been so deregulated, consumer control is really difficult to exert in our contemporary media industry landscape in the United States because we have these really massive corporations. Finally, the dominance of the US media industries on a global scale has also made it difficult to regulate and difficult to critique, as these companies have influenced not just within the United States, but also globally, internationally. This disproportionate dominance on the global marketplace, and we've talked about this in the past, is a form of cultural imperialism. And as we've talked about in past discussions of cultural imperialism, many have argued that this is an extension of the imperialist and colonialist legacy of the United States. The US dominance in the media marketplace makes it difficult for other countries to compete. Even as we saw in the past in our week on movies, how much media is actually being produced outside of the United States. But even with all of that production, it's extremely difficult for other companies to compete even in their own countries, which effectively eliminates most of the competition in media industries on a global scale and gives the US media a great deal of unchecked power on the global landscape. So this means that US media and the business around it shapes the ideals not only of the US, but also of other countries, because many people don't even see themselves or their local cultures represented in the media that they consume, but rather they see white, Western, American ideals and values of capitalism called the culture of the American dream. And those often don't represent what they experience locally, and so produces a kind of cultural disconnect. Now, there are some who argue that there is also some good that comes from cultural imperialism, or at least from the presence of US media in other markets. Those can be that it might offer the possibility of more of a culture of the free press and ideas that we talked about last week of the First Amendment and the notion of being able to speak critically of power. Other things that are seen to be beneficial is possibly the notion of our book calls it a global village, which I'd like to resist, but we could say at least the possibility of some shared cultural reference points, but at what cost? As the US media industries have remained largely unregulated and uncriticized, there is little that hold US media in its industry responsible for what they export abroad or the impact that it has. Okay, everybody, we kept it short this week to make up for last week, which I know was super long. Thank you for your patience last week. For this week, make sure you read chapter 11, watch your lectures and the documentary on Bezos. Make sure that you do your Achieve assignments. Check out your classmates' mass media mini lecture. I think there's only one this week on oligopolies. If you do choose to do the writing analysis option this week, first of all, make sure that you haven't already done a content analysis, because this counts as content. It's not a survey. You're not talking to people. We have 2 more weeks of surveys coming up if you want to choose one of those. That's probably a safer bet. If you haven't done one of your mini studies, that's a mini study. Do one of those. If you've already done a mini study and you need a second one, this is a good one to choose because this is content analysis. When you're doing your analysis for this and you're thinking about why certain countries still have so many American films in the top 5, don't just tell me that it's because people prefer American films, right? I want you to think about everything we've learned this week. Think about the meme on the previous slide from Family Guy. Is it that we live in an open market of competition, or do oligopolies prevent other companies from competing at the same level and overly privilege certain companies in markets by controlling channels of production, distribution, etc., as we've talked about, right? But don't tell me it's about personal choice, because that's not what we've learned this week, right? I want you guys to really think about how all this stuff plays out. Everything that we talked about this week, everything we've looked at when we've talked about media industries in film in the past when we did Film Week, right? So keep those things in mind and how you're understanding how this stuff works and how you're talking about it. If you have any questions, let me know. Take care. Have a good week.